Okay, well, I'm gonna start. So we're going to talk today about Virginia's Community Flood Preparedness Fund, which is getting real very soon. By way of background or in context, whatever, if you think you've been going crazy on activities related to resilience in Virginia, you're right. The comments are due today for those of you who want to comment on the state's attempt to put sea level rise into our tidal wetlands guidelines and standards. The state is also, because of legislative changes, putting climate change into our Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, which is our shoreline preservation regulatory program in Virginia. Those comments are due May 3rd. The comments on this program, on this grant manual for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund are due in 1 month, May 12th. I'll go into this a little later, but there's also the finalization of this grant manual will probably be quickly followed by an actual grant round with RFPs in June, and there'll probably be a second grant round later in the year. And then throughout the year, we're going to be watching the progress with Virginia's Coastal Master Plan and the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee for the coastal areas in Virginia. So busy times in Virginia. So the Community Flood Preparedness Fund grows out of legislation passed in the 2020 session, which had Virginia joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. RGGI is basically a carbon credit auction where the power providers have to buy carbon credit offsets for their carbon emissions. Those credits generate money. The money returns to the state. The RGGI is a regional market that reaches from Maine and now to Virginia. Virginia is the southernmost state. The first auction was about a month ago, and it generated about $43.6 million for the state. The way the legislation was written, 50% of that money goes into a low-income energy efficiency program, and 45% of the funding goes into this Community Flood Preparedness Fund. So the Community Flood Preparedness Fund received about $19.6 million in this first auction. The law states that monies in the fund shall be used solely for the purpose of enhancing flood prevention or protection and coastal resilience. As with, if you were on an earlier webinar, as with our attempts to put climate change into the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, coastal resilience is not defined, even though it's one of the end goals. So somewhere, somebody's got to define coastal resilience for us so we know what we're doing with these programs. The flood fund will be administered by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. The guidelines are developed by them, Secretary Strickler, who's our Secretary of Natural Resources, and our Special Assistant to the Governor for all things flooding, Ann Phillips, who I think is on this call. The fund is non-reverting, so this means the money doesn't go away at the end of the fiscal year. So this is a special fund, and it's separate from the general fund. Monies are for local flood protection and can be used for studies of state and regional significance. This large fund, non-reverting and separate from the general fund, is for me, a blinking yellow light politically. And I think going forward, those of us in the state who want to protect this fund from those who would use it for other purposes need to be aware of attempts that are likely to be made to divert this funding to other places. And we can talk about that in the chat. The fund is statewide. It's not just coastal, it's riverine. It reaches into the valley and south side. So Roanoke, flooded areas in Stanton, Harrisonburg, this fund is for you. Localities can use the fund primarily for the purpose of implementing flood prevention and protection projects and studies in areas that are subject to recurrent flooding as confirmed by a locality certified floodplain manager. So that's one of the first filters. And these guidelines define that locality certified floodplain manager as an official certified floodplain manager. So that's a new piece of information. This person has to be a CFM. 25% of the money is set aside for low-income geographic areas. The statute defines that as any locality or geographic area. And that's open-ended, not census tract. I assume it can be any geographic area designated by the locality. That area has to have a median income less than 80% of the local median household income, or be in a an area designated as an opportunity zone, enterprise zone in Virginia, that the Secretary of Treasury, who is now a woman, and that needs to be changed in the statute from a his to a her, or made neutral. Anyway, the area for that low-income geographic area is defined in statute. Priority should be given to projects that implement community-scale hazard mitigation activities. This is not defined in these guidelines. It probably should be, since it's a priority. And projects that use nature-based solutions to reduce flood risk. Nature-based is defined. The fund can also be used for loans, but as indicated by this grant manual, that's not the case this time. So we're not going to talk about loans. The draft fund guidelines that were the precursor to this, the sort of general principles of the fund, were issued in late November. Comments ran through January 31st. I haven't seen any reporting out on the comments or what they said or summaries. So we're still waiting for that. But despite that, the state has gone ahead and issued this draft grant manual to cover the first round of grants. It was issued on April 12, comments accepted through May 12. There are 2 grants expected in 2021, probably one this summer and one by year's end. And I take that from, in the draft guidelines and in conversations with the administration, it was mentioned that the first round, as planned originally, would have an RFP period from April 1 to June 1 with an August grant award. Obviously, that's going to get pushed back, but I think you can expect a first round of grants probably opening sometime this summer. The second round of grants will run the RFP period from August 1 to December 1 with an end of the year award. So whatever the dates are, be prepared for these grants to become real and go live. And so if you're a locality or a regional government, I think as you're commenting on these guidelines, you probably need to start thinking about how you're going to put together your proposals for the program, because it's going to happen very fast. The top line, as I said, the auction generated about $43.5 million. DEQ takes $2 million off of that. They get 5% for overhead. They're using the funds to run the program, and I'm hearing that they're creating climate office, although I haven't seen anything confirmed on this. In separate legislation in 2020, our state DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, was tasked with putting climate change in all of its, quote, programs and regulations. So this is a big step forward for DEQ, and I think they're going to use some of this money to staff that operation up. The flood fund then got about 19.6 million. DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, I think gets 5% of that for its overhead. So that's about $1 million. The low income set aside that I mentioned for low income geographic areas is about $4.5 million. And based on conversations and from the guidelines, that money remains until expended. So if we don't spend all that $4.5 million in the first round, the unexpended portion rolls to the second round, and so on. There are going to be 3 more auctions in 2021. One in June, one in September, one in December. The initial reading from Reggie is that they will probably generate about as much money as this one. So we're probably looking at somewhere in the range of $80 million available in 2021, which would be about 20 million or so for low income areas. Now this 80 million is big time. To put it in perspective, FEMA identified, did not fund, but identified about $34 million in projects meriting further review in Virginia in 2019. So FEMA didn't even get halfway up what this is probably going to generate. The Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, which is a big deal for stormwater projects in Virginia, is only, quote unquote, only 20 million. So this fund is larger. It's going to be one of the largest environmental / mitigation programs in the state. And it really has to be established and viewed as a first-tier program. And I will throw in some editorial comments here. This grant manual does not rise to that standard. This grant manual is very hard to read. This grant manual is largely boilerplate from another program that DCR runs called the Dam Safety and Floodplain Management Program, which is about a $1 million a year program. The structure of that grant manual had the flood fund, the Community Flood Resilience Fund sort of smooshed into it. And there are a lot of places where there is language that was carried over inappropriately and where flood fund language was not defined. And anyway, it's a bit messy. So I would encourage everybody on this call to take a look at the manual and provide all the comments you can, because this manual and the subsequent manuals for the subsequent grant rounds really have to be pretty tight. This is a big program and a big responsibility for all of us. So what do we got in here? Again, projects should primarily be in areas subject to recurrent flooding as certified by a local floodplain manager. 25% of the fund's low-income areas. Unspent funds roll over, and priority for projects that are community scale hazard mitigation activities and use nature-based solutions to reduce flood risk. So essentially it looks like this. You got your money, most of it going to areas subject to recurrent flooding, high priority for community scale and nature-based solutions, and then 25% of the money that's expended goes to low-income geographic areas. So that's in a cartoon what this program looks like. The basic guidelines: grants are reimbursable. So you spend the money, locality, and then you get reimbursed. Only low-income, limited capacity communities. This is from the manual. I have no idea what that means. I think they mean low-income geographic areas, but I'm not sure. There is no limited capacity community anywhere in the definitions. Will receive an upfront payment, recognizing they may not have the cash reserves to spend the money and then get reimbursed. All others must finance the initial costs on their own. This, I think, is something that a lot of smaller localities need to look at carefully and offer suggestions on, because this could be a barrier to participation. Some of these, especially if these projects get very large. Grants from the fund cannot be used as a match for other grants. So you can't take this fund money and use it as a non-federal match on a federal grant. You can't use it, for instance, in a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant as the in-kind match. So you can't use the fund with anything else. There's no leveraging, and you cannot use other funds as the local match. So you couldn't use a NOAA Coastal Resilience grant as a match for the state fund. This is something that I think, again, a lot of people need to look at. This is something that a lot of us who commented on the grant guidelines said, no, these grants should be used for match to leverage other money. But in this case, it's been decided in this draft anyway that we can't use this fund as a match, and other funds, non-local government funds, cannot be used as a match. There's also a provision that says no project or portion thereof identified in a previously awarded reimbursed application from DCR is eligible for funding. I'm not quite sure where this came from. It is in the existing dam safety program, but essentially, if you got money from DCR's heritage program, in theory, you couldn't get money from the fund for the same project. If you got money from DEQ or somewhere else, you could. So I'm not quite sure what this means, but be aware that there is a prohibition against coming back into a project that DCR has funded previously. Eligible entities, it's local governments, which is defined in the definitions as any county. Well, you can read this. It's basically any political subdivision. Now, when you start looking through the statute at who that at the Code of Virginia and who that includes, local and regional governments are eligible. Soil and water conservation districts are subdivisions, they're eligible. The rural coastal Virginia community enhancement authorities are eligible. But then you start looking around, and the Virginia Port Authority is eligible. The Offshore Wind Development Authority is eligible. The Hampton Roads Regional Arena Authority is a legal public subdivision, a political subdivision. So I think there probably needs to be some narrowing down and more specificity here. I don't know, unless you want the Hampton Roads Regional Arena Authority to apply for resilience grants. Not included in here are private sector, nonprofits, Native American tribes, and I didn't see any mention of state agencies. Now all of these entities can partner with those eligible entities and grants, and I think that's probably the way things will go going forward. Basic guidelines: you got to have a locally adopted resilience plan before you can apply for funding. And this is something we all have talked about for a long time, is give me a plan. Don't just give me projects. Give me a plan for your locality. Locally adopted, it's not defined, but I assume that means approved by the electeds, the city council or the board of supervisors, since you're encumbering local government money. I think that's what that means. If that's the case, then I think that the program has to be aware that that's a do loop that sometimes takes a couple months. And so it may actually add to the application process. But anyway, you got to have a plan that's been approved. There are planning, study, and capacity building grants available to localities. This is a great piece here because it begins to provide some of the lower resourced, smaller towns, counties, cities with the resources they need to begin to develop a plan and also put a grant together. Project grants have to be completed within 3 years. The planning, study, and capacity building grants don't have a deadline, but I'm sure they expect them to be done on a shorter time frame. The projects, the stuff that's going to protect you against flooding, have a minimum of $50,000 and an unlimited top end. So the size of these grants will range from $50,000 to who knows what. The who knows what is going to be, of course, based on the money available and the scoring and the priority setting process. Planning, studying, and capacity building grants have a minimum of $25,000. And I had a question about this because, for example, if you were going to send somebody off to get certification as a CFM, that's only a couple $1,000, but there's a minimum here of 25K. So I guess the thing to do would be to bundle all of your planning, study, and capacity building needs into one grant in order to meet that minimum of 25K. But that may be something that folks want to comment on. So this is essentially how it looks. You got a resilience plan that's been informed by a prior planning grant, or maybe a study and capacity building grant, hire an engineer to do the studies you need, whatever. And then you get the locally approved resilience plan. The project application follows once that plan has been, and I guess the plan has to be approved by DCR, but it doesn't indicate how you get a locally approved resilience plan to be approved. But anyway, so you put the project application, again, you can use study and capacity building money to help put the application together. Again, you got to have a local match. As you do the grant gets, the money gets reimbursed to the locality, and then you have project completion and closeout. So that's roughly a cartoon of the flow of the way the pieces of this are going to work. Grant match is required, and there are different categories here. Category A, you can see this, that the fund is going to pay most of the money, 75% of the money, for planning and capacity building. This is a cool thing because it's going to put some money in the pockets of a lot of these localities that have been needing to put planning together or need capacity in the locality. For the flood prevention and protection studies, again, the fund will split it. For the actual project, C, D, E, and F, there's a sliding scale here that basically gives you a higher percentage of funding from the fund, the higher the value of the green infrastructure in the project you're doing. So if you're in Stanton and you're going to put a levee up downtown where it's flooded, but you're also going to do a lot of work upstream, putting green infrastructure in up the creeks and bioswales and all that stuff, that project comes in. If the green infrastructure is 50% of the project cost, then the fund will pay 55%. So the higher the green infrastructure cost, the more the fund will pay. Now, for low income localities, which again is a term that is not defined, I assume this would mean a grant with low income geographic areas in it, although somebody's going to have to clarify that in the final grant manual. The match is the same, except the planning capacity and the flood prevention and protection studies, the fund will pay 90%. So this is an attempt to move more money towards those localities that need the most help. Eligible activities for the grants, again, no loans. The plan's capacity building, basically minimum 25,000 can help you to develop your locality level flood resilience plan. Capacity building that's it, one sentence. It probably needs some amplification about what they're after, but basically you can see that you can use that capacity building grant to help staff up, to get technical expertise, to get your CFM certified, whatever. So that's the first piece of it. The actual grants themselves, the projects, again, eligible applicants are, this is from the grant manual, the draft grant manual. Eligible applicants are limited to local governments. Multiple localities can do joint proposals. For projects involving construction or acquisition, you got to have a long-term O&M plan, operations and maintenance plan. And the grant manual goes into detail about examples of these construction, acquisition of property, stream stabilization, revising floodplain ordinance, hydraulic studies of floodplains. Doesn't quite fit there, but what the heck. And then the second category is studies and data collection of statewide and regional significance. So this would be like rainfall data, modeling of watershed flooding tendencies, stream gauge networks, and the rest. Again, because of the way this paragraph is structured, it does not look as though state agencies can request the funding, which then raises the issue, you know, why would Stanton, Virginia request money for a watershed scale riverine modeling that includes 3 or 4 localities? So this would be an area where a number of localities or a PDC would probably want to come together and do one of these larger studies in order to get the data they need on, you know, flooding from sea level rise along a reach of a peninsula, flooding in a watershed, and that. So that, I don't know, that probably needs a little more evolution, but I think that's what they're after. So the community resilience plan, this is from the manual, a plan for the purpose of the CFPF. This is an example where this document needed about 2 or 3 final edits. I think what they mean there is fund. Elsewhere in there, the Community Flood Protection Fund, or the CFPF, is referred to as the fund. So I think they mean fund there. I'm certain they mean fund there. So the plan is project-based, incorporates nature-based infrastructure, includes all considerations of all parts of a locality, regardless of socioeconomics or race, includes consideration of other projects and activities, timeline, and based on best available science. The plans, when approved, again, there needs to be a process here to describe how DCR checks the box and says, yes, your plan's sufficient, are good for 3 years. Now, in the manual, it states, you know, we're not talking about a full-blown Virginia Beach, you know, $800,000 plan here. We're talking about, in this first round, taking the stuff you've already got on the table, the comp plans, the hazard mitigation plans, and the rest, and putting it together into a plan to get into the first round. So take a careful look at that, and especially localities and regional governments, make sure that that fits your needs. Now, from our perspective, when we looked at this, there were a couple of issues here. One is that first consideration says it's projects based on flood control and resilience. The statute says that you've got to put these studies or these projects in areas that are subject to recurrent flooding. So we feel as though somebody needs to identify those areas subject to recurrent flooding, because when you get into the grant round, you're going to be asked to certify that. So it's better to do it in your plan. The second piece is, this is, number 3 is a pretty, I think it's trying to get at the low income geographic area issue, but it really doesn't. It is probably worthwhile for localities to try to get to identifying those low income geographic areas, because again, you're going to need them when you finally get into the grant round. From our perspective as well, there probably needs to be, maybe not in this plan, but the next plan, a greater involvement of these communities in the decision-making on the projects, the planning, so that this is not simply a drive-by effort where these localities are not fully engaged, because the statute's pretty clear on this. The last piece, best available science. This has been a nettlesome problem in other proposed regulations, specifically the Chesapeake Bay, the Tidal Wetlands Act, that says living shorelines are now the default erosion control method unless best available science proves otherwise. So this debate about what constitutes best available science and where you find it has been throughout a number of these regulatory proposals. So I think there needs to be some refinement of that in here. Climate change impacts is rather broad. I think that they need to specifically indicate which ones we're looking at. Sea level rise rates, there is a reference to Executive Order 24, which leads you to a sea level rise rate that's roughly the NOAA intermediate high curve. And current flood maps, again, would probably be better. A better way to do that would be to look at those areas subject to recurrent flooding, since again, that's a legislative mandate. Anyway, resilience plan comes first. It's pretty basic this time around. So next comes the project application. These are the elements of the application. The critical piece of it here is the project information. And as we went through this, we noticed that that did not include any information about whether the project you're proposing is in a low-income area or whether it's in a frequently flooding area. So let me just show you, I'll switch over to another screen here. I wanted to show you what's up here. So this is from the draft grant manual, and it talks about this scope of work narrative that I was just talking about. And it talks about the information that needs to be in the project. And, you know, just to be a little snarky, you can see it's drawn almost verbatim. This is the dam safety and floodplain management program at DCR. So population, value of property, historic flooding, it all tracks through here. In the information that you have to provide on population, it talks about an environmental justice community. I have no idea what that means. I think they mean low-income geographic area, but that needs to be fixed. Historic flooding data, again, that probably should be areas of recurrent flooding. So there needs to be an inclusion of these priority areas that the legislation has mandated, especially when you get down to these areas later on in the information required for the application, where it talks about other items necessary for project study or project study or study priority. This, again, the document I have up now is the dam safety manual, and this language was taken verbatim from that. This now is the draft guidelines, and they're not appropriate to this program because the program legislatively does not establish a priority for critical facilities. So why would you have to list them? So I think this section needs to be rewritten to completely to better reflect the legislative priorities. So let me go back to my presentation here and get off my soapbox. Oops, there we go. So project application and reporting. So this is another issue where there's some head scratching on my part anyway. This up top is verbatim, that the department will conduct project inspections as necessary. Project deliverables as defined will be reported 30 days following the project end date. Now these projects, remember, are 3-year projects. There's no mention here of interim reports on deliverables and milestones. The reimbursement request is laid out in the draft grant manual. Under the fund, you'll get quarterly reimbursements. So, but there's nothing in there that says when you request reimbursements and you prove you've expended the money, that you also have to report on how you are in meeting the guidelines. So there probably needs to be a little tightening up here so that you're not, you know, 2.5 years out and going, oh my gosh, you guys are way off track with this project. These interim deliverables will help keep the project on track. The project eligibility and scoring, there's a rubric or a matrix in here. Again, some questions. Number 2, does the local government have an approved resilience plan? Someone has to decide whether the plan's adequate. There's nothing in here that says, tell me if you're in a low-income geographic area or if this project is in an area of recurrent flooding. The area of recurrent flooding that's required by the statute appears nowhere in either the minimum requirements for the application nor in the scoring. So this is the ranking. These are some of the projects that are available. I mean, the ranking of the projects that they'll fund. You can see a very high priority on acquisition of property, which is a good deal because that's the best way to get out of harm's way. But as you go through this, there are a couple of issues that are sort of a head scratcher. The capacity building is only 5 points. I'm not quite sure how you, this one form is being used apparently for all applications. So I'm not quite sure how you would, if a capacity building is only getting 5 points, but your acquisition, anyway, I'm not sure how this works. This needs, I think, some questioning on folks' parts. And then only 10 points for the low income geographic area, but it's supposed to be 25% of the funding is supposed to go there. So I think there's some work that needs to be done on the scoring sheet. And I would really point people who are going to be applying to this program to go through this and make sure this is right, because this is going to mean whether or not you're going to get the funds. So finally, need the comments on this draft grant manual. You got to look at how well it meets the statutory mandate. We'll be talking, I think, in our comments about that. But how will this work for you, the applicant? What else is needed in this document? What's going to make your life easier? What gets in the way? I think we've all got to look at this and get these comments in, because again, as soon as this grant manual becomes real, they're going to go live with the RFP, I'm certain, on this. So May 12th, the comments are due. We have a couple of resource pages that you can go to for, we have a resource page you can go to for information on this and all the other changes. And then if you want to sign up for our occasional periodic updates on these issues, we're doing a newsletter, the Commonwealth Resilience Brief. And I'll stop there since it's been half an hour. I'll be happy to take any questions. I'm not sure I can answer them, but I'll be happy to take questions.
Awesome, Skip. Yeah, we did have a couple questions come in that I have lined up for you. So our first question is from Eileen from the Sierra Club. She asked if there will be a sign-on letter for this, or Wetlands Watch would be willing to share our comments. She's just looking for some guidance on making their comments. Yeah, we'll put together some. I think at first we'll identify some areas of concern, sort of like I skipped over lightly in this, and then try to put together a comment letter. We did this for the draft fund guidelines, and we'll try to get something together 10 days out, something like that, so that people can have a chance to digest it. Awesome. And then our next two questions are similar. They're about the local resilience plan that will be required to apply for other funding in the flood fund. One says, does it get into how broad or comprehensive the plan has to be that is adopted? Is that a concern? And then the other question that's related is, can a regional plan approved adopted by a locality meet the requirement in the manual for the plan? I'm going to pull up the information on the plan here in a bit. The state is attempting to be very flexible on the front end, realizing that you know, not everybody is a Norfolk or an Alexandria or Virginia Beach or a Hampton and has a plan that they can pull off the shelf. And so they're trying to be flexible on this. I think that this is an area that would benefit from a conversation with the state, but I think this is something that people really need to offer their views on, because it is critical. This is the first speed bump before you get into the program. And so let me just pull this section up real quickly. So this is the part of it that talks about the plan. And it says a plan can be one document or a combination of documents. Again, it's good for 3 years after DCR certifies a locality. I assume that means there's some process where you send the plan to DCR, and not a locality, but a local government, as defined under the code, has met the minimum requirements. But it talks about how you can satisfy the requirement through unified plan, several existing plans. For example, a comp plan and a HAZMIT plan together may satisfy this, so long as the appropriate documentation is in there. So there isn't much in there. It's on page 15 of the draft manual, and I'd urge you to look at that. And ask questions of DCR, frankly, because again, that's the first speed bump that you're going to hit before you get into the program for the funding. Awesome. That was all the questions we had directly during your presentation. So please keep sharing your questions in the chat, and I can relay them to Skip. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Skip. It seems like you're about to say something else. No, that's fine.
There were a couple comments. Did you want to?
Yeah, we did have. We had a comment from Jennifer. She said a locality may want to know how much water is coming from other localities to have a foundation to request better stormwater management from their neighbors. That was a comment we had. It's not a question, but a good comment.
Yeah, I think that's where working through a PDC, especially if you've got a regional hazard mitigation plan where somebody's begun to look at some of these issues. We looked at, I think it was the state of Washington. There are 3 other states that have state funds like ours that we looked at. The state of Washington actually has their projects have to be on a watershed basis in order to get at this issue. So if you apply, you have to apply within a watershed, and you have to basically bring the other localities in the watershed into the project with you for exactly this reason. I think that this is also something that would be very fundable under the studies of statewide or regional significance to get this kind of information so that you could better plan for and develop a project for this kind of thing.
Awesome. We did have a couple more questions come in. Question/comment from this one is from Matt. He said, can we request that recurrent flooding be defined and tied to a measurable standard, such as 10% annual chance return interval shown in a community's flood insurance study? Yes,
Matt, you can request. No, I don't mean to. I think that's definitely needed because the definition that's in there sort of gets at what this is, but I think that, you know, especially as you get close to actually putting shovels in the ground and developing projects, you probably need a little tighter definition of what this is. So I certainly would comment on that.
And then our next question is from Allison. She asked, if a locality does have a plan that could qualify but identifies a need for future plans, would funding be possible, or would the locality have to focus on projects?
It's a good question. I think that I would get the first plan in if it qualifies, just to get in line, but definitely use that study and planning money to further refine that plan. There's nothing to prevent you from having a plan in, but needing additional planning. That planning money is, as I understand it, going to be used throughout the process. So you can use the money for capacity building and planning on the plan itself, but then you can also use the money on developing a project. So, I did not see anything in here about how frequently you can apply for the money. So I assume you can come back. The one prohibition, though, remember, is that if you've got well, it was only for a project. If you have a project that DCR has already funded, you can't come back in. That would be a question to ask, is the prohibition against subsequent funding is on a project, not on a plan. So I assume you could come back any number of times for planning money, but that's something that will need clarification. That's a good point. But anyway, I would get the plan in and approved and then try to fill in, just so you don't lose your place in line.
Awesome. We have another question from Eileen. She asks, is there a possibility that a low-income community that floods exists in a locality that doesn't apply, or perhaps doesn't know to apply for these funds? And if so, what can be done to prevent that from happening?
That's a good question. The set aside of 25% of the fund for low-income communities would empower those communities to approach the locality and say, hey, basically, you need me, I'd get you into that 25% fund if we talk about what funding is needed. But that assumes that the locality and the low-income geographic area know that the fund exists. We are trying separately, and I know Ann Phillips is working hard to try to get outreach done on this to achieve exactly that, so that all these communities are aware. But yeah, it is possible that that you could have a low-income geographic area that floods that somebody would not know about. But I would also bet that any savvy locality would begin looking for these communities in order to include them, which is the right thing to do, but also access that 25% set aside. So there's actually an empowerment of these communities because of that set aside.
Awesome. Okay, so we had another question here. Velma asked, do we have any notion regarding why there's a prohibition against using other grants as a match? Seems like it works against multi-benefit projects.
Yeah, I had exactly the same reaction. Again, the prohibition is only against DCR funding. Oh, wait, on the match, excuse me. Yes, the match is a bit puzzling. So, it just seems to me that if you've got $1 in the fund, you would want to be able to match, say, a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant and get $2 out of it. I'm not sure why that's there. To me, that's a sort of a blinking red light that needs to be dealt with. Again, I do not know why that's in there, because most of the comments all of the comments that I read that addressed the match said there should be a matching ability. So I'm not sure why that's there, but it needs flagging.
Keith asks, goal is to fund most cost-effective solutions. Is there anything in the guidelines on how this will be evaluated or determined?
I didn't see that. I did not see anything about how that would be determined. Whether the measure is dollars per loss avoided, like a typical benefit cost analysis, or what. There was no analysis in there regarding that. I'll have to look and see where that shows up, but there's nothing in there about how to determine that.
Kristen Owen says so this is more of a comment in regards.
Uh-oh, this is dangerous. Kristen woke up.
In regards to the matching conversation, this is interesting because I don't think we pointed this out for ourselves yet. It says she said the grant manual does say the following on page 10 in quotations: if a grant is sought for a study, project, or activity that will be carried out in concert with a federal agency, the applicant must have authorization to enter into any necessary written agreement with the federal agency endorsing the study, project, or activity, including any provisions for cost sharing. A copy of the agreement must be submitted with the application, end quote. And then she says that isn't necessarily specific to matching funds, but for the dam safety floodplain grant, which we know a lot of this language is drawn from for the grant manual, she says is used similar language and was interpreted by DCR to include cost share agreements and using the grant as a federal match. So I think what she's saying there is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Kristen, you can come off mute, is that it's kind of confusing because it's very clear at the end of this grant manual, and it says in bold letters that you can't use this for any type of cost or for any kind of match. But then in a separate part, I guess on page 10 of the grant manual, it kind of suggests that you can.
Yes, that's what I was getting at. So, I think they just need to clarify this because I mean, obviously a lot of the language was copied over, and with the other grant, they did allow it, and we actually encouraged it especially for communities, that didn't necessarily have resources available. If they could. It's really difficult to do a match with like a FEMA grant because of all the timing and everything, but Army Corps, for instance, has different projects that are not grants, that are just cost shares. And so we actually at DCR did do a cost share agreement with them for dam safety projects using the dam safety floodplain grant. So I don't know if they just missed that language or if that was kind of the idea still, and it just doesn't, like the rest of the language didn't align with that. I don't know, but I think it just needs to be clarified and brought to their attention in all of our comments. Yeah,
I saw that and couldn't make sense of it because I wasn't quite sure about it. It definitely needs some explanation. And I think again, to go back, I think this prohibition against matching is also something that needs examination. Yes, some of these, like Kristen says, coordinating with some of these agencies, forget it. It'll be 5 years. But NIFWIF's fairly quick and nimble. And the last round of NOAA coastal resilience grants that we saw, they're pretty quick and nimble. So there are a lot of situations where having this match would really give localities a leg up on being able to compete for some of these grants that aren't as cumbersome as, say, a FEMA grant.
Okay, so our next question comes from Tanisha. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Does the manual discuss anything about identifying eligible low-income communities? I recall you mentioning that eligible recurrent flood areas are not explicit.
the definition of low income geographic areas is in the statute and is in the guidelines. And again, it's a locality or a geographic area, the scope of which is not defined. It doesn't, not census tract or what, doesn't say. But it's an area that has less than 80% of the average surrounding income, or is a designated HUD federal government opportunity zone, which is, I think, also enterprise zones in Virginia, but I'm not sure. That's all that is in there. And I think it would be up to the locality to identify, well, it will be up to the locality since it has to be in their application. It'll be up to the locality to identify those areas. And there's probably going to have to be some back and forth with DCR, as to whether the area is sufficient, frankly. I mean, you could do a Donald Trump Sharpie and just sort of draw the line on a project and pick up a couple of neighborhoods that are low income. Is that enough? I mean, does it have to be the majority of the geographic area or the majority of the area that's protected? Or there's a whole lot of, when you sort of peel back the layers, there's a whole lot of stuff that does need to be figured out so that people aren't using low income as a way of getting leverage on a grant, or, like I said, having a project in an area that's in the capital improvement plan in a locality, but is in a moderate to high income area. And if they just go 3 blocks over, they pick enough of a low income neighborhood up to qualify. I mean, there really needs to be some clarification on that, but it's going to be locality by locality, unless there is some stricter guidelines put in place by DCR. This is something that is new to all of us and needed, but it's also, I think, something we're going to have to work through. I think, again, for those low income communities, or as they're referred to somewhere else as environmental justice communities, I think it is an opportunity to engage local and regional government authorities, again, in a position of equality, because there's a 25% set aside. These folks actually have money in hand when they begin these conversations. But I'll get off my soapbox.
This is a fun question. Skip, be ready to shoot them out, all right? Does Wetlands Watch have top concerns, a top 10 list? I know you're super prepared for that coastal communities should consider when drafting comments. It's something that can be emailed out to the group later. So
yeah, I'll be happy to get together with the people who work with me who are smarter than I am and figure out what those might be. I think that as I read through this, the issue of the plans was very important, because I think that the localities have to be encouraged to do a much more comprehensive job than most localities have done. On the other hand, if you require too much burdensome stuff in the plan, you're going to really nail, frankly, most of the state that doesn't even have the basics of the plan. So I think the plan is the critical piece. Again, you can't get into the program without a plan. And I think that again, over time, the engagement with the plan is going to be a critical thing. I would have to go back through the scoring process to see which way the scoring sort of tilts things. But we've been at this for about 10 days and I'm still scratching my head about this program. So as elucidation occurs, we will be happy to share our sort of top 10 concerns. I think, but I think localities also need to sort of sit and go, okay, it's day one and I need a plan. Oops, who's going to approve the plan? Okay, let me mark that. Let me put that on my comments. How is this plan to be approved? All of that needs to be, I think, laid out. So I think for people who are familiar with these kinds of programs and projects, walking through this, sort of step by step, is going to be the most useful way to do it. We could provide some input, but we don't work for local government. We aren't in the seat of a lot of the people who are actually going to have to run these programs.
Awesome. Morgan Butler from the Southern Environmental Law Center asks, any concerns with the prohibition against using the fund for longer term maintenance? So to cite back to that, currently in the grant manual, it says that projects should only be 3 years long. And then Sarah Edwards adds on to that question asking, are there any concerns whether private, federal, or other sources could be factored into the long-term maintenance plan?
No, there was nothing about other sources. I'm going to have to go back and look at that O&M. There has to be a maintenance plan, and there has to be a commitment on the part of the locality to do the O&M work. And I'm not sure it talks about what happens in year 4, 5, and 6. You know, like after the project's in place. Whether there needs to be like an escrow account or a reinspection or anything. That's an area that probably needs some looking at. We wanted to make sure, and this was in a lot of the comments, that there was an O&M plan, because so often localities get these projects and then there's no O&M money. And so some of these projects just sort of go away because they're not being maintained, especially some of the nature-based solutions. Shereen knows this better than I, but there needs to be continuing maintenance on a lot of those projects. And so there needs to be a plan and some funding. But it's on the locality, and I assume you could use somebody else's money for this. And not just have, in other words, you could use private, federal, and other sources for the O&M work, the operations and maintenance work.
We're
But again,
rolling
it's
into
subject
the
to
last 5 minutes of our time here.
Okay.
And I just wanted to actually thank Madison and recognize our 6th employee. We spent a lot of time talking about somebody who's not an employee anymore and forgot to acknowledge our great hire, Madison Teeter. And she's been doing an amazing job of keeping track of all the questions and answering them. Are there any last minute thoughts or things that you want to say?
Well, I didn't know, because the first part of that question from Morgan was, do we have any concerns about there only being projects only being 3 years long, was the first part of that question. And then, yeah, we can wrap it up if you have any. And I think we actually got to all the questions. So after that, you can wrap it up if you want, Skip.
Well, the 3-year project scale is to allow time for construction. Is that?
Yeah. Do you guys mind if I jump in with a little bit of explanation?
Morgan, please do.
Excellent. Yeah, I guess it's on page 10, part 2A.
Are you a lawyer or something?
12D. If you just look at page 10, the little d that's about a third of the way down the page, it to me suggests that there's clearly no intent for fund monies to be eligible for maintenance of the project over the long term.
Right.
We've got to have a maintenance plan demonstrating how the project will be maintained at local expense, with at local expense in bold, over the lifespan of the project. So I'm just curious, is that, to me, it's pretty clearly saying this is not to be used for maintenance. So I just wondered if you had any concerns with that. And based on what you've already said, it sounds like you think it probably would be helpful to have funding be available for maintenance, even if not necessarily from this fund, because of the importance of maintaining these projects over time.
Well, and there would be a question of whether, for me anyway, whether the O&M money would constitute a local match. So in other words, if I'm going in for a project that's X tens of thousands of dollars and I know it's going to cost me $5,000 a year to maintain it, can I use that $5,000 a year as my local match? I mean, that would be one way of sort of backing some of this expense into the project. I don't know. That's not dealt with here. But the idea was, I think, to get the locality to take ownership of this and not just have this be, somebody showing up and dropping a project off the back of a truck, because we've seen so many of these projects fail because there's no O&M. But again, in most of the localities in the state, that could be a deal breaker if those expenses get too high. So I think that's something we all need to look at. For us, it was something we thought was needed, but if I'm in Rockingham County, does it work with the budget I've got in Rockingham County to encumber my budget for forever for this flood control project? That's a good question.
Thanks, Skip.
We had one more question come through if you think we have time for it, Skip.
Yeah, I think we do. Why don't you go ahead and,
Okay, Skip, this is about the cost share, the sliding cost share that the grant manual outlines. Sarah says, I'm also curious if using cost to determine the sliding scale percentages is the best measurement, or is there another feasible metric that would be better for the proportion of the nature-based solution? And she suggests maybe geographic area.
Yeah, Sarah, I agree with that. I was thinking about that as well, because if I get off cheap with a nature-based solution that protects 70% of a watershed, and the very expensive gray infrastructure only protects 30% of the watershed, shouldn't I get more credit for the nature-based solution because it's actually reducing the flood risk in a larger part of the watershed? It's, you know, there are lots of angels that dance on the head of that pin. I'm not sure how you would figure it out, but I think that it probably, as time goes on, we're going to have to move away from a straight cost estimate. And I think that's something that people need to comment on, because it makes tremendous sense to say, okay, you know, these 25 bioswales and impoundments that I put into protected 90% of the watershed, and I've got this gray infrastructure at the end that costs 3 times as much as they did, and I don't get the cost share that I should, based on cost, but based on area protected, I would. That's a very good point.
could I just say something about the O&M? I think it really is valuable to make sure people understand the importance of it. And a lot of times we see these nature-based practices failing if they're not properly maintained within the first 3 years during the first 3 years where the vegetation's really establishing itself. We often have it just, we see them failing. So I think it really is important to make sure that localities and everybody understands the importance of it. And I've actually encouraged NIFWIF, for instance, to fund post-construction maintenance for at least a couple of years. So I just wanted to bring the importance of that up as well. And we're at 1:30.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Lots of great questions.
Yeah. And use those questions to drill down on the manual. And if you want to get a hold of us, give us an email. I think, as Matt said, we'll probably send out something that is at least initially a top scale or a top line areas of concern. But this brought up a lot of stuff. The issue that Sarah raised was a great one. It's like, wait a minute, why are we using cost? Shouldn't we be using area covered or value of protection? I don't want to get into a Corps of Engineers cost benefit analysis, but there are other ways to get at this. All right, thank you.
Have a great weekend and thanks for coming.